Have you ever wondered what PTSD is, or that's post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, in today's video, I'm going to talk about just that, but with a twist. We're going to take the case study of Thomas Shelby, or Tommie, from the Peaky blinders to try to understand PTSD in all its complexity. So today we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, what it is, a little bit about the different symptoms. So that would be the physiological symptoms, the emotional symptoms, the behavioral symptoms. And also we'll talk about substance misuse and how this connects to something like PTSD. But of course, this part of the video will actually be of interest to anyone who's impacted by substance misuse. And this, of course, can affect other mental health problems as well. And then finally, I'm going to look at daily functioning and what that's like for Tommie and for someone who might have PTSD like Tommie. And then just a little bit at the end about treatment options. So the character of Tommie from the Peaky blinders, he experienced real trauma and horrific experiences in World War I. He also lost his mother to suicide way before, and he has had a tough start in life. Now, he's experienced a lot of difficult things growing up, and of course then being a very young man in the war and all that comes with. And you know, throughout his life, Tommie has lost so many people, and these are people that are very close to him, close family. His brother, his daughter, who's very young, his wife, of course, Grace. And then there was Aunt Polly. That was really sad. Other people, and then just all the difficulties that comes with his day-to-day life as well. The violence, lots of hypervigilance going on, and I'll come into that a little bit more later on. So lots of traumatic and very difficult experiences. So when someone experiences lots of different traumatic events, and especially if they're of an invasive and interpersonal nature, they can develop what's called complex trauma. So this is a different form then of trauma. And of course, PTSD can develop, because let's talk about what that is. PTSD can happen to anyone when they've experienced a traumatic event. So just one traumatic event. What it essentially is a response to that traumatic event. So essentially, the way that event has been processed is not quite working for the individual. And so further processing is required for that person to be able to essentially, and this is the difficult part of it actually, because when something really difficult and traumatic happens to us, of course, as human beings, we will respond in a way in which we are impacted by that emotionally, and of course in other ways as well, psychologically, physically. And this is normal. This is how we should respond. We are human. But it's about how this memory of this trauma, how this continues to impact an individual if that person is unable to work through it in a way that's healthy and for them to be able to function. So then, as I said, complex trauma is when we have more traumas being compounded on. Essentially, when someone experiences PTSD, what they're doing is they're reliving that initial traumatic event in their present daily life. Just because someone experiences a traumatic event or any kind of traumatic experiences does not mean they will develop PTSD, because this depends on the individual and everything that comes with them. So that's their psychology, their genetics even, their upbringing, their development. All of that will determine for some individuals, whether PTSD develops, it also depends on the event itself, a person's sensitivity to that type of event, perhaps also what's going on for the person in their life in that very moment when that thing happens. You know, are they more vulnerable to developing PTSD at this particular point in life? So there are so many variables as to whether someone will develop PTSD. It's important to know that a traumatic event does not predict PTSD. It may or may not develop depending on lots of factors. So let's think about what happens to Tommie over the series in terms of the physiological symptoms he experiences. And of course, this then applies to other people who have experienced trauma and an event in which they develop PTSD. So as I said before, due to the nature of Tommie's present life, he's often in a very hypervigilant state. So he's emotionally hyper-aroused. He's always there waiting for something to happen, probably very anxious a lot of the time, kind of expecting something to happen, something bad, not really able to relax in his day-to-day. And I think we've all seen this in the series. Sometimes he seems quite on edge. Like I said, he's not able to relax. He's waiting for something to happen. And this is a really difficult state to be in a lot of the time. In terms of his PTSD, sometimes we see Tommie experience flashbacks. So he's actually back there, like I said, reliving that experience, feeling those same emotions, that panic. That's another physiological symptom there, or at least an experience that creates physical symptoms. So for instance, increased heart rate, shortness of breath, tension. The person fears they're going to die, might not be able to breathe, and they want to get out of where they are. We've seen Tommie wake up from nightmares. So flashbacks are sort of waking experiences of reliving. And then you have the nightmares when someone's asleep. They cannot get away from it. It's not even like sleep is the escape. Sleep can also be invaded. And this is horrible because Tommie might find it difficult to fall asleep in the first place. And this is in part due to this hyper-aroused state. It's in part due to substances, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it's also to do with the fear, perhaps, of the nightmares that are to come. And then when he does fall asleep, he has those terrifying nightmares. He wakes up shaking or sweating or both, increased heart rate, as I mentioned before, and just feeling very, very scared. You know, we as human beings, we all need to feel in control. But for someone like Tommie, control is even more important because of the lack of it he has had since the earliest times. I mean, you know, your mother leaving you in the way that she left Tommie, the lack of control in that situation as a child, who children have very little control actually, but to lose his mother in that way, for Tommie, control is going to be really important. And when someone is feeling on edge and startled and panicked and frenetic and on edge all the time, I said that already, but when someone is feeling those things, they're not going to be feeling in control. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be for someone like Tommie. So we're kind of coming on to the emotional symptoms now, and I'll just speak a little bit to those. You know, Tommie survived the war, and he would have lost many people along the way. He would have seen death. He would have seen friends, comrades die in the war. And this can make someone who survives feel guilty and feel like they should have died as well. And then if we're thinking about the other losses that Tommie's faced in life, you know, losing his brother, his wife, his daughter, his very young daughter, you know, for someone to lose all those people, often an individual who loses someone can wish that they could die with them because they miss them so much and they want to be reunited with them. And so all of these losses might make Tommie want to, well, we've seen him experience suicidal ideation in the series. He wants to die. He even attempts it. Depression, of course, would have been there. We can see that along the way as well. Of course, the anxiety and the panic. So there's a lot of kind of emotional impact. There's also this sense of failure that Tommie might feel. I mean, he's highly accomplished person when he puts his mind to something. Of course, we're talking about criminality, but I mean, if we think about what he could have done and what he did do in the world in which he lives, he is incredibly accomplished. And also, he's someone who is a provider. You know, he's looking after his family. He's the head of the family in some way. Some would argue it's Aunt Polly, of course, but he is the patriarch of the family, you could say then. And he is very much feeling quite responsible for everyone. And yet, Tommie, even though he has all of that going on, those accomplishments, he will still feel like a failure at times. He will still feel shame. He will feel this, perhaps in part due to the fact that he is struggling. Because for Tommie, the fact that he survived and others didn't, the fact that he has what he has, and that he is a man, and he's very much embroiled in this kind of world of violence and fighting and aggression, for him, struggling emotionally will feel like a failure. Why can't I just get on with this? What is wrong with me? Why am I so weak? These are the kinds of things that a man like Tommie might feel about himself. And then we did talk about the suicidal ideation. So the sense of hopelessness, especially seeing so much death and experiencing so much loss of people that are so close as well. So there will also be irritability and anger as well, and probably rage, of course. We've seen this come out at times in the series. You know, Tommie sometimes can be quite explosive, and this is when he can't control that rage, that inferno that's going on underneath. So all of this can then impact how someone behaves, how someone is in the world. And of course, I've kind of touched on it in ways as well, but I'll be a bit more explicit now. So Tommie is obsessed with his work. Yeah, I mean, everything he does is relating to work. Even the things when he's socializing and networking. He's always thinking ahead. He's always thinking about work. He's pretty much doesn't switch off from work. And this is kind of like a distraction as well. This allows him to focus on something other than the things that do come up for him with the PTSD itself. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the panic, the loss, the anger, the rage, you know, all of this can be set aside for those moments when he's pretty much occupied with work. So another thing that Tommie does in terms of behavior is the substances. And we talked about this before. So he's constantly smoking. That's pretty hallmark of him. He's always got a cigarette hanging off his lip. Looks pretty cool, I must say, but it's not good for him. And it's a way to relieve stress for a lot of people. His penchant for whiskey, neat spirit, which is very strong. He is drinking this quite a lot of the time. And again, this is another way to avoid, because it can make someone for a time feel or forget and just feel maybe some relaxation because it's a depressant. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the substances in a moment. Now, Tommie also will avoid certain places, certain people. So a person with PTSD does not want to be reminded of things, and reminders can come in the form of smells, you know, the place itself, the person, something about the person. There can be lots of things that can remind someone, and then because someone's avoiding a lot of the time in the ways described, those things, those disturbance in the person is just waiting to be triggered because it hasn't gone anywhere. It hasn't been resolved. It's just waiting there to be triggered by something that jogs your memory, that takes you back to that place in some way. So Tommie and someone other than Tommie who has PTSD would likely want to avoid. So that's another behavior. So there's avoidance in the form of distraction, working all the time, substances, and then also actual avoidance of places and people. And another way of avoiding, I guess, is his relationships. So if you think about the relationships he does have, Tommie kind of holds people at a certain distance. There's a certain detached way to him. People can't really get that close to him. He does have people that are close to him, I guess, you know, his second wife, his brothers, Polly, others, people that he gets close to, his wife, of course, Grace. But there's always this part of Tommie that they just can't seem to reach. And this might be the part of him that just really needs to be reached and accessed and to feel safe. But because he doesn't a lot of the time, he's very protective of it. And this is all subconscious as well. So that's another way of avoiding, isn't it? In our relationships, we can avoid as well. So that's by keeping people at a certain distance, keeping those walls up, and in so doing, affecting the quality of those relationships as well. And as I said before, Tommie is very much embroiled in a criminal world. He's going to be experiencing actual reason to be hypervigilant, to be looking over his shoulder. So, and of course, bloodshed. People dying around him, murder, all of this stuff is happening. And it's actually mirroring not just the past experience, which resulted in the PTSD initially, but also it's going to be mirroring his internal state of fear. There's actual reason that he needs to be afraid, because his world actually is one in which there is real danger and threat to his life a lot of the time. So now let's talk about the substance misuse and how that impacts as well. As I said, Tommie smokes and he drinks alcohol. There are, of course, physical health implications and risks to a person when they do these things. We're quite aware of those. Some people might not be as aware to the level that we should be, but these are drugs. So cigarettes, we have nicotine, we have alcohol, which is ethanol. So these are actual chemical compounds that alter brain chemistry and our neural activity, and they can make a person, so it's not just physical health problems like affecting our hearts, liver, lungs, and possibly leading to things like stroke, heart failure, liver disease, obesity, which can lead to other things, and lots of other physical problems. Because they alter brain chemistry in the way they do, there is the risk for things like panic as well, anxiety, depression, emotional problems. So these are only going to exacerbate what Tommie's already experiencing anyway. Alcohol also inhibits sleep. Now, people often drink alcohol because of its soporific effect, which means it can make us feel drowsy and make us feel relaxed. But actually, this is a bit of a double-edged sword, because sometimes people might take alcohol to relax. They might think, oh, I've had a tough day or a tough week, and now I just want to relax and drink some alcohol. But actually what that can do, it's quite misleading and misguided, because alcohol, what it does is it disrupts and hinders sleep. So it can help people to fall asleep because it is a depressant and it slows down the body and, motor function, speech, reaction, everything. But what it also does is it means that the sleep cycle that we have is going to be disrupted. So when we sleep, we experience cycles of sleep, and those cycles repeat through the night. So we go from light sleep to deep sleep, and there's kind of gradients throughout. We then will go from light sleep to deep sleep again, and then from light sleep to deep sleep again, and so on, a good few times in the night. And this is why sometimes people can have several dreams in the night, because we have deep sleep, REM sleep over and over. That's if we're sleeping properly. However, alcohol actually can stop us from getting into the deep sleep. So what will happen is a person will fall asleep because of the soporific effect. Then what will happen is they will wake up before they hit deep sleep. What that means is when they fall back to sleep, they will not go into deep sleep. The cycle resets itself. So they start from light sleep again, but then they'll wake up before deep sleep and again it resets. So they never get that deep quality sleep. They will wake up feeling quite fatigued, a bit groggy maybe, might have headache, cognition will be affected because they haven't slept properly. They just won't feel like they've rested. And this is even though they took it because they needed to relax. So this is the irony, isn't it? And this is going to affect Tommie, who's already experiencing insomnia and nightmares and all of that. Now, the other thing is the cigarettes. Nicotine is a stimulant and a depressant. People will often take nicotine to relieve that stress. They'll take the first puff or two, they'll feel that kind of calm, it eases them, it relaxes them, it makes them feel good for a short time. But because it's a stimulant as well, it doesn't help with actual anxiety. So it might feel like stress is relieved, but over time, if you're putting that into your body, that stimulant effect exacerbates anxiety. So then you actually need the drug, that initial kick again, that initial release, that initial stress reliever. You need it more and more because, as you can see, there's this kind of vicious cycle that's developed. The tolerance increases as well as with alcohol. Both of these as ways of coping strategies for anxiety or depression or to try to relax are really misguided and actually going to do the opposite. So as you can see, as you've probably seen if you've watched the show, which I would highly recommend you do if you haven't, daily functioning for someone with PTSD who's experiencing it, for Tommie, is really tough in a lot of ways. So many things, so many parts of his life are impacted by PTSD. And because he's living in quite a detached way a lot of the time, he doesn't create opportunities for himself to experience pleasure. Firstly, he might not even be able to experience pleasure because he numbs himself so much. When we do that, it's not like the brain can decide to experience positive emotions as opposed to negative ones. And the reason I'm doing that is because all emotions are important and none of them are negative as such. Yeah, you can't choose which ones you will experience. The brain will either numb itself, in which case even the ones you want to experience are going to be numbed and hard to do or feel. So Tommie isn't able to create opportunities to experience those things like pleasure and joy. And he might not even be able to, even if he did create those opportunities. So it's quite difficult. That's really going to affect his daily functioning and mood as well. Then, of course, there's the substances. This impacts him. There's his obsession with work, his work being antisocial and criminal in nature. All of this, of course, is not going to be good for anyone, and especially someone who's experiencing PTSD. So it is really important for anyone who's experiencing PTSD to get in touch with a mental health professional who can help you to work through it, just because it needs to be worked through. So it can't just be something that will resolve itself, as we've seen in the series, and as I'm sure many people know. It needs professional help because it's very complex and it's a real difficult mental health problem to be dealing with, to be experiencing. Then there's also the other things that come with it, the compounding things, like perhaps the way someone copes with it, the substances, the inability to socialize, the avoidance. All of that will impact how severe it becomes and how it can lead on to other mental health problems, as we've seen with Tommie: anxiety, depression, suicidality, self-harm, you could even say, with substances. So it does need, or at least the person needs, professional help with it. And in terms of professional help, one of the more well-known approaches to trauma is EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So this is a way for people to learn how to process the trauma, which was not processed properly. And so doing kind of take the weight out of it a little bit and help them to cope better. Now, there's also other ways of working with trauma, not just EMDR. This is something that is perhaps considered a gold standard, but that doesn't mean that there's not other approaches that work well. There very much are. What those often entail, or, well, what that depends on is the person, what they need, what's going to work for them, and their psychology, and essentially also what they want. Because some therapies might give us more of a short-term solution, some will give us a longer-term solution. It just depends on what we're looking for. And that's how we would want to work, dependent on you as an individual. So if you're someone who's experienced trauma or is experiencing PTSD, because as I said, you don't have to develop PTSD if you've experienced trauma, but you may still be, of course, impacted by trauma in a different way. And we would want to help you work through that if that's the case. So you can get in touch with us. We're here to help. And I hope you've enjoyed this case study with Thomas Shelby and talking about PTSD. Do subscribe and like, and join us again next time. Thanks for watching.